UMass just announced that they're heading to the MAC, and while regionality might be a loose term nowadays, again, point you to USC and UCLA joining the Big Ten, Midwest. This seems like it's a win for the MAC, given there are clearly going to be two realities in college football, right? The super conferences and everybody else. And I don't think that anyone is under the assumption that the MAC is maybe ever going to compete for a true national championship. But as we look at the landscape of college football and where these regional products can still thrive, to me, it seems like a great move for the MAC. They get a football team that certainly has had an increased amount of resources put into it. They're recruiting well, certainly compared to what they've done in the past. They've got other sports that they can compete in, like basketball, that raises the level of competition for the MAC. I'm really in favor of this move for the conference. And I think it sets a precedent, especially as we look towards like Conference USA, that, hey, some of these Division II schools or independent schools, now's the time to gobble them up and really kind of plant the flag for what the future of your conference is going to look like.
Yeah, a couple things. So this we are seeing the slow death of the independent college football team because this now leaves two, just UConn and Notre Dame, with Army joining the American and UMass to the MAC. I think this is a win-win for the MAC and UMass. UMass obviously had a hell of a time filling out a schedule over the last few years as an independent, and they are playing just multiple games that they have no business playing in other than picking up a check. So for the program standpoint, from a winning football game standpoint, and a potential to actually compete for a bowl game and compete for, something more than just winning more than two games every year, this is really, really good for UMass to have programs closer to their caliber filling out their schedule rather than having to play like three or four SEC teams every single year. So good for UMass, good for the Minutemen, one of the best mascots in college football, by the way. And yeah, I think you're right. I think this is a nod to regionality. We're going to see that more and more with these G5 conferences, not just from a budget standpoint, but from a true rivalry standpoint. This is going to be where rivalries are preserved. I've seen a lot of celebration that it feels like UMass is coming home to the MAC, where it's where they belong. And yeah, I mean, we're going to see a lot of this in these G5 conferences where true rivalries are celebrated. New ones are going to develop, obviously, as teams play each other more and more. But those true regionality rivalries are still going to mean a lot in these conferences.
Yeah, to me it feels a little bit weird. It doesn't really feel like regionality, but I guess when you have, like we were just talking about Los Angeles being Big Ten country, it's not that weird. It's still close enough, and it feels all right. For me, look, the MAC is one of my favorite little conferences, right? In terms of the littler, you can't really call it G5 anymore because too many conferences are falling by the wayside. But whatever you would have called the G5 before this offseason, but they're one of my favorite conferences in that group, and I think that their big move forward is just finding a way to stay fun and relevant because I think outside of competing, which they're going to compete for, certain bowl games, their top teams will get in with some of the sort of middle teams, and they'll be able to compete for some, bowl games. But outside of that, the way that this conference stays relevant, and I think the way that a lot of these smaller conferences have to stay relevant, is being something we have to watch, being something where it's fun to watch these games, actually turning it on just for the sake of watching the game, not for the sake of what is it going to do for standings, or is that going to knock them out of the top 12 or whatever it is. You just have to care about watching the game for the sake of the game. And the more they can do that, the better it is. How do they do that? Well, obviously, I think being on the odd times, right? Having random, like it's a Tuesday afternoon and there's action, right? And so you just have a game on at a random time. That's always great. But I do think part of it is, yeah, keeping it regional, keeping it to where the fans care about the game that's happening, right? If your fans have a sort of, built-in rivalry or a desire to show up to that game, the environment's going to be better. People are going to show up. It's going to be fun to watch, and that energy can kind of come off your screen a little bit. And so I think that that's kind of the path forward for the MAC and for a lot of these other, kind of smaller conferences that have to find a way to compete. There's not going to be a path for most of these conferences to compete for championships right now. They have to be something that TV wants to pay for, right? You have to be, attractive to ESPN or attractive to Fox. And if you can do that, then you're going to find yourself on the other side of it, right? Maybe it is adding, one of these other, teams that you could maybe grab another, what is it, UConn, or, snag them, or find another team maybe in Conference USA or something that you could snag, or just finding some way to keep adding teams, adding smaller teams, going down to, D2, snagging teams, just finding a way to add teams that are going to make your conference more fun and more watchable. The more you can do that, the more I think these teams in these conferences can succeed, which ultimately long term will help those programs stay relevant. And, who knows, maybe a random small team gets a playoff bid, makes a Cinderella run, and you could see a championship come out of one of these.
We saw UConn get left at the altar by the Big 12 conference. I had it on good authority that the Big 12 had extended a verbal offer, that UConn was really just dotting the T's or dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And instead, the Big 12 goes and poaches half the Pac-12 conference, and UConn kind of informed, hey, your services are no longer needed. I wonder if they're a good fit in the MAC, or maybe they go to the American. We'll see. Again, these smaller conferences having to kind of bid to figure out who's going to be the next real edge, the next real X factor as far as that conference's ability to compete. Football, basketball doesn't really, I think, fall to one specific sport, because they've got to think of things so much more holistically than the SEC or the Big Ten, who obviously have great competition in all of those sports. But let's be honest, football, basketball, those are the money makers. The MAC, UConn, maybe having to consider a lot of other factors as well. I think Conference USA, as I mentioned earlier, having to look at Tarleton State. I think West Florida is potentially a candidate to jump up to the D1 level. They've been doing all kinds of fantastic things down there at the D2 level. The Argonauts, a great football team down in West Florida. So anyway, just keep your eyes on that.
Gracious, how about that?